that we are just waiting for someone else one of the other panelists to join us. And we're just gonna wait to make sure that all attendees are able to log into the system properly. So we will get going in about 5 minutes. So if you just hang on, we will be right back with you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, the briefing on communities of color and SCOTUS. My name is Sarah Medeiros, and I'm the Communications and External Affairs Assistant here at the National Women's Law Center. A few technical notes before we begin. All attendee lines will be on mute during today's webinar. We will be taking questions after our experts are finished with the main presentation, and we encourage you to submit questions throughout the webinar. You can submit a question by typing it using the GoToWebinar chat window visible in your GoToWebinar dashboard, which can usually be found on the right side of your screen by default. The webinar will have live captioning throughout, which you should be able to see now at the bottom of your screen below the presentation slides. And lastly, the webinar will be recorded. As a registrant and attendee, you'll receive links to the recording of the presentation as well as the slides within the next few days. At this time, I'd like to turn the floor over to Gretchen Borchardt.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody. This is Gretchen Borchardt. I'm Vice President for Reproductive Rights and Health at the National Women's Law Center. And on behalf of the Law Center, in our own voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda, the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, and the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health, I want to welcome you all to this briefing on communities of color in the Supreme Court. We are really excited to share these findings with all of you, and very excited to have Tresa Undem here with us from PerryUndem Communications. She is going to walk you all through findings and some top lines and some messaging and all the great research we have. After you hear from Tresa, the groups involved in the research are going to offer some reflections, and then after that, we're going to open it up to Q&A. But first, to kind of get us started, I and Jane Liu at NAPOF are going to offer a little bit of kind of background and context to help frame the discussion up a little bit. And what I'll say is that, you know, we knew going into this that there's been a lot of polling and messaging work around the Supreme Court already. And the Law Center, National Women's Law Center, has participated in some ourselves, including a recent project with Planned Parenthood Action Fund around abortion that many of you have already heard about, including from Tresa. But, you know, even though a lot of that polling has oversampling of communities of color, the research so far really hasn't done the deeper dive to focus exclusively on communities of color to find out their level of awareness about the Supreme Court vacancy, what issues matter most to them in this fight, whether they're willing to take action, what that looks like, and the messages that are best to effectively engage communities of color. So all of that is really what we set out to do with this research project, and we all came together very quickly and worked on a very fast timeline, and there are some caveats and limitations to this research, which Tresa is going to mention, but overall we're just really excited about it. We're excited about the findings. We've heard from many of you, our coalition partners, that you all are hungry for this kind of research too, and so we wanted to get it all to you right away. And so we're presenting these findings. We'll be following up shortly with a more detailed messaging memo, but in the meantime, we just wanted to get you all on this webinar to hear directly from Tresa. And so thank you all for joining us, and now I'll turn it over to Jane at NAPOF, who is going to provide a little bit more additional context. Jane?
Hi, can you hear me? This is Jane from NAPOF, and We're really excited about this polling, and I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the context behind it and why we saw such a vital need for data that focused on communities of color. What we were seeing was lots of polling and surveying, as Gretchen said, but none that was focused on women of color, communities of color. And what was happening was that in our conversations on the ground with members of our communities, we were seeing that the overall messaging and focusing on abortion and reproductive rights was not fully resonating with women of color in our communities, and we wanted to see what kind of messaging would resonate. And we were also not seeing enough messaging through an RJ lens, so we wanted to see what kind of messaging would work in our communities. Obviously, there's no question that figuring out how to message to our communities is vital and important. It's absolutely critical for us in terms of effectively mobilizing our communities to action around the SCOTUS fight. And we also wanted to figure out how to better inform our communities about the Supreme Court and how it impacts them, and so that they can be more aware of what's at stake for them. And finally, we just wanted to note that the focus on communities of color in this polling, was really consistent with our belief and our desire to see reproductive justice reflected in the messaging that we do. Reproductive justice is based on the recognition that numerous circumstances and factors impact a woman's ability to make decisions about their bodies and families, and because of that, women of color and communities of color see their reproductive rights as inherently connected with a lot of other issues that impact their lives, including immigrant rights, healthcare access, criminal justice, etc. So we really believe it's vital that any messaging to our communities around reproductive rights and women's rights reflects that reality. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Jane. So now we will turn it over to Tresa Undem from PerryUndem Communications, who has been doing a lot of messaging work already, and we were fortunate to be able to build on that experience and expertise she already has, both around the Supreme Court and communities of color and reproductive rights and justice issues. So Tresa, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you. And it was, this was really a great study to do. We, as Jane said, the messaging is different, and in the polling we've done so far, we haven't been able to really dive in. So it was just really great to be able to do this project. As Gretchen said, it was very fast. I think we wrote the questionnaire, discussed the questionnaire, revised the questionnaire in 2 days. So that's about the quickest we've ever gone, but I think we got a lot of really good direction and insights for messaging. So let me talk about the methods first. So we did a national survey on the next slide of 1,800 adults. We did not exclude voters. We wanted to include, did not exclude non-voters. We wanted this to be more inclusive. So this was 1,800 adults who say in that traditional Roe v. Wade question, they don't want Roe v. Wade overturned. So this is about, when you think about, so these are 600 Black adults, 600 Latinx adults, 600 API adults who all don't want Roe v. Wade overturned. And that's about close to 8 in 10 Black adults, close to 8 in 10 API adults, and about 6 in 10 Latinx adults fall into that category. So we excluded those who want to overturn Roe, since this is messaging about the court. It was conducted July 20th through August 1st, and we used YouGov, which is an online sort of non-probability sample panel provider. And in sort of my research of what online vendors are the best or among the best in terms of non-probability samples. And this is only conducted in English, unfortunately. When we do Spanish or other translations, it takes several weeks to do it right, to do the transcription and the translation correctly, and we just didn't have a few weeks. So unfortunately, this was just done in English. So let me go through the first couple findings starting on the next slide, are just around sort of feelings toward the political climate and how are people feeling? Are they motivated to still act? And here's what we find about, this is a funky formatting. Probably should have used a PDF here. Looks like computer font from like the 80s. But anyway, okay, so we asked, do you think things in the country are heading off on the right track, wrong track? So 88% of Black adults, again, remember these are, don't want Roe overturned when I say Black respondents. 88% say we're off on the wrong track. 75% of Latinx respondents, 75% of API respondents. Among all adults right now, among the general population, it's about 55% say we're off on the wrong track. Among voters right now, it's about 52%. So not surprisingly, communities of color do not think we're in a good place right now. We asked whether the political situation right now around race and immigration has had a negative impact, has it had a negative impact on your physical or mental health? About 4 in 10 across respondents say yes, the political environment around race and immigration has had a negative impact. On the next slide, we wanted to sort of assess kind of the resistance among communities of color. And so among people who said we're off on the wrong track, which again is about 3/4 or to 90% of folks say, yes, we're off on the wrong track. We asked those people, how do you feel right now? Do you feel determined to help change things? Do you feel hopeless about trying to change things? Do you feel determined and hopeless at different times, or are you not interested? So if you look at the shaded in gray boxes, you get majority saying I feel determined to change things, or at least I feel determined at some time. So this is a pretty strong findings in my mind. You only get about 1 in 5 saying I feel hopeless, and you know, about 1 in 10 or less saying I'm not interested in changing things. So people are still feeling determined at least part of the time. On the next slide, so we asked a few questions, of course, about their sense of abortion and access and at risk. And again, I apologize for the font here, but we asked, what's your impression? Is the right to abortion in our country at risk or secure? And about 68% of Black and API respondents feel that the right to abortion is at risk. 6 in 10 Latinx respondents feel that way. We also asked, do you think being able to afford and find abortion care in our country is becoming easier, becoming harder, or has it been staying about the same? And you can see about 50% of Black and API respondents feel that access is becoming harder. 43% of Latinx respondents say that. And then most of the rest say it hasn't been changing. So there's a sense that the right is at risk. There's a sense among about half, close to half, that access is becoming harder. But as we see on the next slide, as we see in all of the research we do, there's really a lack of real knowledge on this issue. We asked this question, as far as you know, is abortion legal in all states, in some states? Is it not legal in any state, or are you not sure? So you can see the numbers there. About 1/3 of Black adults, Latinx adults say it's legal in all states. Half of API respondents say it's legal in all states. And then about 1/3 say it's legal in some states. People do not think abortion is illegal, but there is this sense, and I've heard this in focus groups too, like just a real uncertainty about, you know, what the laws are, and is it illegal in Texas? But it's not. It's legal here. You know, there's just a real uncertainty. I don't think that necessarily relates strongly to the message advice we're going to give. It's more of a proxy for knowledge and the work that needs to be done around increasing knowledge on the issue. On the next slide, one thing we were all interested in is, do people really connect this, and concerned about is, do people connect the Supreme Court to their own personal lives? As we know, people aren't going to act if they don't feel really personally affected themselves or really closely held values. So we asked how much you feel that Supreme Court's rulings affect your life and the life of your loved ones. So you see 30 to 38% say it affects my life. Those rulings affect my life a lot. And as a pollster, those strong numbers, the a lot, that's what we really look at. That's the best measure of, do people really feel, do they really feel impacted? So not lots of room there, and lots of people just saying some, or even if you look at Latinx respondents, 38% say it doesn't affect me much or at all. We also asked about knowledge and to get a sense of, do we have to do some education on the Supreme Court, what the purpose is, what they do? So about 22, you can see the number there, 22 to 31% say they know a lot about the purpose of the Supreme Court and what it does. The sum numbers here, I think, are helpful. And then not sure, you can see again, a little bit higher with Latinx respondents, 48% say they're not sure, don't know much about the Supreme Court. So I think there is a need to have, a brief description or part of the messaging, even just a sentence, especially among audiences that are less informed, to reiterate what the role of the court. On the next slide. So even though there's a lot of lack of knowledge, people's assumptions tend to be right. So again, we saw a majority feel like the right is at risk. They're much more likely to think access is becoming harder than easier. When we said, let's say President Trump's nominee gets approved, do you think the support will be mostly conservative, liberal, or about equally balanced? And you can see that they tend to be correct. They're much more likely to say the Supreme Court is going to be mostly conservative than liberal. On the next slide, so we wanted to gauge you. We did this in a recent poll. Do people think it's likely that the next Supreme Court is going to overturn Roe, is going to restrict access, is going to restrict the rights of people, restrict health care? Do they think it's likely? And the reason we ask this is, does there have to be a lot of persuasion that these things are at risk? And I don't think there does have to be a lot of persuasion. So this is just among Black respondents, but it's similar across the board, is if you look at, how likely is it that the Supreme Court would, the first one is, side with President Trump over rights? 60% say yes, that's likely. Kavanaugh becomes a new justice, and we told them there was a new, Kavanaugh was the appointee. Would that happen? Likely, 60%. Chances are 50-50, 27%. So odds are 50-50 or better. You add those two up, you get 87%. So all of these things we looked at got, a majority saying, yeah, odds are, 50-50 or better. And in each of those, both for Black respondents, Latinx respondents, you can see right here, when we looked at restrict women's access to abortion, respondents are more likely to say that's going to happen than overturn Roe v. Wade. So you can see with Latinx right here is a 10-point difference. With Black respondents, it was a 12-point difference. And if you go to the next slide, with API respondents, it's was a 15-point difference. So, and you'll see in other slides too, and I think this was the assumption anyway, but it's nice to have data behind it, that access is probably a better way to talk about when we exclusively talk about abortion. Access is probably better than the right or Roe v. Wade. The next slide, speaking of, so we asked, and this was toward the beginning of the survey, to you personally, how important is it that a new Supreme Court justice ruled to uphold? Half of respondents got the Roe v. Wade decision, and then the other half of respondents, randomly chosen, got a woman's access to safe legal abortion. And then we compared people who said people who got the question, how important is it to uphold Roe v. Wade? And you can see in that first row, among Black, Latinx, API, first of all, majority say it is personally important to them. And then with the people who got, how important is it personally to uphold women's access to a safe legal abortion? A little bit higher numbers, 7 and 10 or more among those groups. If you look at the very important, so who said this is very important? You can see that access, upholding women's access to safe and legal abortion was particularly strong, especially among Black respondents. But across the board, the people who got access were more likely to say it's important than people who got uphold the Roe v. Wade decision. You can go to the next slide. So one of the things we tried to do throughout this survey, as I mentioned before, was figure out how to connect this issue of the Supreme Court, of the nomination, how to make this personal. So we asked a series of questions about, let's go to the next slide, actually. We asked a whole list of questions, all of these items, all of these issues, and we asked, we said, here's some issues that the Supreme Court could make decisions on in the near future. How important, if at all, is each of these issues to you personally? So sometimes in polling we ask, is this a high priority for Congress, or do you want your state elected officials to work on, access to healthcare and priorities? This was really about how important are these to you personally? And then the scale we had was it's extremely important, it's very important, somewhat important, not too important. Numbers you're looking at here are extremely important. So one point is all of these issues are important to communities of color, to majorities of communities of color. But what we're really looking here is that at the extremely important, so that we can figure out, okay, if we're talking about the Supreme Court, what are the top issues you want to connect it to in a way that people feel personally engaged? So across the communities, racism and racial justice, civil rights, access to clean water, especially high among Latinx and API voters, but among all voters, those, and then access to quality, affordable health care. So racial justice, civil rights, clean water, criminal justice system, health care. You see among Black voters as well, voting rights and economic, job opportunities that pay a livable wage. Among Latinx, a lot of those issues as well, but also women's equality tends to be among the, second tier issues for them, and immigrant families being separated. Among API respondents, the top two kind of are separated from sort of separate, the second tier issues. I mean, they're all strong again, but access to clean water and affordable health care really stand out among API voters. So when we're putting together, sort of the summary of the research and what issues to communicate and connect, this is part of what's informing that. And it'll be different by community. We did the same thing on the next slide, and let's just go to the next slide, around Cavanaugh's record. So when you talk about Cavanaugh's record, how do you do it in a way that connects to people's own life? So we said, here are some facts about Cavanaugh's records. Is this a sign, is each of these a sign that Kavanaugh would have a positive effect on you or your loved ones? Is it a sign that it would have a negative effect, or would it have no effect on you or your loved ones? So the top ones across the board is Kavanaugh believes the president should be given more power to do what he wants. Kavanaugh believes the president can't be above the law. And then discrimination, or that Kavanaugh has sided with bosses against workers who have been discriminated against on the job. But the president and sort of siding with the president, I think there's another question we don't include in this. Oh yeah, we do. Okay. But the sort of siding with Trump comes up top in a couple of places in the survey. And then, it's a find among all groups, majorities of all groups, that Kavanaugh has argued that a boss's religious views should override an individual's right for birth control. And then Kavanaugh has ruled in the past to restrict women's access to abortion. And then we gave the specific example of blocking a young immigrant woman from getting an abortion. And you can see, even talking about restricting abortion, it's pretty high in this list. It's not that far behind. It's very close with birth control, if not about the same. And then not too far behind the larger issues around the president. Let's go to the next slide and then the next slide. So we also had a more general message series about taking action against Kavanaugh. So did any of these things make you want to take action? And we're looking at the definitely numbers. We have, definitely, probably not, definitely not. So the top ones are sort of the more broad messages. The Supreme Court, I'm looking at the second one here. The Supreme Court must have justices that uphold the rights, freedoms, and opportunities for everyone, no matter our race or ethnicity or where we come from. The first one, Supreme Court justices have lifetime appointments to the court. Kavanaugh would be ruling against people's civil rights for decades to come. There was one that, and we've seen this in some other polling, that sexual harassment was really strong, and that was among, actually I think it was polling in some swing states among all voters in some swing states, but that ranked among the top here too, that the Supreme Court justices, we must have justices that uphold workers' rights, including protecting workers from sexual harassment. Another message is the fourth one down. The Supreme Court will make decisions that affect abortion access, healthcare access, immigrant justice, and the opportunities for people to be financially stable and live free, safe, and healthy lives. Again, first of all of these messages do pretty equally well among Latinx respondents in terms of motivating them to act. And you can see the gray shaded ones among API voters or respondents, including the one I just mentioned, was strong. And pretty much they were all strong among Black respondents too. We just highlighted the ones that, tended to be a few points higher. Just two more points on this slide. One is, I think it's still important, even though split A, this is third from the top, or third from the bottom here. Judge Kavanaugh would turn the balance of the Supreme Court against women's rights and access to abortion. That even though it may be, a second tier, makes me want to take action, I think that's a really important message. Because of the lack of knowledge and lack of awareness people have right now. And it's very descriptive, and it tells, in some other research we've done, it does a lot in just that one sentence. So we've been saying that, don't say swing vote, don't say the seat is, a single vote, because that's unclear. Well, he could go my way. This is really saying Kavanaugh would turn the balance of the Supreme Court against. And here we have women's rights and access, but I think you could fill in the blank there. We did, I've been thinking myself, I know it's, in the past, it's been good to talk about a woman, because you kind of can maybe empathize with a woman versus women. Honestly, my gut is that talking about women right now is better. We split sampled that one I just talked about with the one at the bottom. Judge Kavanaugh would turn the balance of the Supreme Court against a woman's right and access to abortion. And it pretty much does the same. Women's rights, maybe a couple points higher, but really it was a wash in this mini test. And then you can see the criminalization message here also did well among Latinx respondents. little bit less well than the ones about Trump and sexual harassment among Black respondents, and the same with API respondents, but still a good message, we think. On the next slide, we kind of want to get a sense at villains, who are the strongest villains. And so we asked this question: the Supreme Court will likely be more conservative with new justice. Would you be concerned that the Supreme Court might side with any of these groups? We had them choose two that would concern them most. So here's again where we get some distinction around Trump and his administration. So by far, that's the biggest concern, is that the Supreme Court would side with Trump. Among Black respondents, then it's police and law enforcement. And for others, as well as Black respondents, it's third, people with conservative religious beliefs. We don't have all the villains here, but it just helps us sort of get it, also just a proxy of where people's concerns are. And again, this administration is top. On the next slide, so we asked at the beginning and the end of the survey, your senators will be voting on Judge Kavanaugh. How likely are you to contact your senator to voice your opinion on their vote? And we see a lot of movement. So the percentages at the left here are at the beginning of the survey prior to any messaging. So, 13 to 14% say I'm very likely to contact my senator. And frankly, some of those people are probably even not very likely. Like, it's inflated a little bit. And then only about another 10% are somewhat likely. But we see pretty significant change among Black voters by the end, 14 points more likely. Latinx voters, 19 points more likely to contact their senator. API respondents, 8 points more likely. And that's a pretty big shift. We usually don't see those high numbers in a survey. I mean, people just are kind of unwilling to change their mind, and it's just a survey. It's just a 15-minute survey or whatever. So this makes me pretty hopeful that the messaging and the little bit of education and messaging we did will have some power. On the next slide, we also talked about this was at the end. How likely are you to do any of these things? So contact a senator, you can see at the bottom. And as I just mentioned, those numbers had changed from the beginning. Sharing social media, about the same. But talking to friends and family, more likely to do that. And I'd say, in all the work we do, that tends to be, learn more about the issue and talk to friends and family tends to always be the first actions people are going to take. And in my own head, I used to dismiss that all the time, but as not really actions. But I've really changed my mind where honestly, they're the two biggest actions you want them to take. Obviously, in the Supreme Court, probably number one is you want them to contact a senator. But on RJ issues and abortion broadly, we need people learning and we need people talking, because the number one way they're going to learn is through their friends and family. Probably, especially on abortion, they're not going to learn through the media or news. So that is such a key action in my mind right now, and it tends to be the most natural. So I think that's good finding. On the next slide, we also got a sense of barriers to action. And the number one barrier, which is great because it's the easiest to overcome, is I need information about what to do. So you can see about close to half of respondents say yes, this is true for me when it comes to taking political action around the Supreme Court nomination. Tell me what to do. Other barriers, I don't like confrontation, but this is high among API respondents as well. And that can mean social media for sure. I don't like, I'm tired of that on social media. It can mean I don't want to call somebody. I don't want to call my senator, but I'll text them or I'll sign a petition. And then I feel like I would not make a difference. that's kind of where that's where the persuasion has to come in. I feel like that I don't like confrontation. That's just a tactical. You need to give people different options and different ways to get involved. Information is very straightforward. So my senator would not listen to me. That's not insignificant. And I think a couple things we hear is, I live in a red state, my senator is not going to pay attention to me. We also hear, I live in a blue state, my senator is also on my side. So you really, no matter who you're talking to, my gut is that you have to explain why it's important if you're in a red state, why it's important if you're in a blue state, to make these calls. It's nice to see that the one that comes in last, which is the Supreme Court, does not affect me personally. Just again, just gives us a little bit of a sense that the messaging and connecting to issues and all of that makes a difference. We think probably makes a difference. On the last slide, so the easiest barrier to overcome in that last slide is getting people information. The real barrier, though, is lack of awareness and knowledge. And when you have, as somebody in a focus group said to me, it's whack-a-mole in the news, and you can't keep things straight in your head, and you can't remember. It's very difficult to remember that there's even a nomination happening when all these other things are happening. So this is the real barrier. We have about a third of respondents say they're going to pay a lot of attention to the Supreme Court confirmation hearing. Again, that's probably inflated a little bit. So again, really raising awareness and messaging that does that. And like I said before, this is happening. The new justice would, Kavanaugh would turn the court against, blah, blah, blah. So last few things, and again, I think Gretchen said this, we'll have documents shortly. We're just sort of doing the final revisions of the message documents. But overall, what this data tells me, connect among communities of color, connect SCOTUS, connect Kavanaugh to Trump. So Cavanaugh's record on presidential power, Cavanaugh's record on his investigations, that to me seems strongest. Connecting to broader issues that communities of color care about, and this is across the board: racial justice, clean water, criminal system, healthcare. I think you can do birth control, you can do abortion, but those are sort of the top issues. The more we can connect to those broader issues, probably the more engaged people are going to be on. More engaged people will be. Using broad messages on civil rights, everyone's rights and freedoms, no matter our race, I think are probably most effective. On the next slide, talking about abortion specifically in RJ, as we just saw, talk about access, not necessarily Roe. It's not that you can't talk about Roe. I mean, you certainly should talk about it if that's what's in the media and you can cite it, but access is going to be more relevant, more important to people. So talking about access, contextualizing abortion and other issues like healthcare access, immigrant justice, criminalization, and opportunities to live free, safe and healthy lives, I think are what the data point to. Again, on abortion, talking about turning the balance of the court against. We have women's rights here and having access to abortion. We use both phrases. And then on abortion specifically, connecting Cavanaugh's record on birth control and restricting women's access. Last slide. It's not often or I should say, at least in the past several years that I've been working on this issue, it's not often that abortion gets national attention or sustained national attention like it did after Kennedy's retirement. And those are key learning opportunities and engagement. I did some work on quote unquote the resistance and studied since the election, like what was their journey through resistance, what made them act, when did they act? And it was pretty clear that they acted when they were acting based on actions and words coming from Trump specifically, and that got sustained media attention. In other words, they were not acting on reproductive rights, for instance. They weren't acting around abortion. It was around DACA. It was around immigrants. It was around Obamacare back in the early part of his administration. So it was really that sustained media attention. So if we get that media attention again, and frankly, whatever days in the future where there is sustained media attention, that is the opportunity. Those are the opportunities to educate people on this issue. The status of access, the status of legality, the threats to access, and we have direction on that as well, and how to do that. Finally, on taking action, give specific details about what to do, what to say, when to do it. It kind of sounds silly, but one thing I remember somebody in our research, people saying about Betsy DeVos when she was first nominated, there was something about having a deadline to people that motivated them. It just made it more concrete. Okay, I have to do this by this date. Give a range of options and channels. Again, some people are phone people, some people are text people, some people are email people. And there's no clear demographics that I've seen that indicate who's what type of person. It's probably more personality based. Persuasion should be focused on, in my mind, why it will make a difference. So convincing people their action will make a difference. I think, one thought is to remind people that when it has made a difference, like not repealing Obamacare. Again, communicate why it's important to contact senators, even if they live in a blue state, even if they live in a red state, and encourage that. Don't underestimate that. Encourage people to share information and to talk with their friends and family about this issue. So I'll stop there. And Gretchen, am I handing it over to Jessica?
Yeah, thanks, Tressa. We're going to have some reflections from some of the groups who participated, and starting with Jessica Gonzales Rojas from the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health. Jessica?
Hi, everyone. This is Jessica Gonzales Rojas. I am the Executive Director of the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health. And many folks may know us, but our mission is to build Latinx power to guarantee the human right to reproductive health, dignity, and justice for our communities. So first off, Tressa, thank you so much for this data. I often find that it sort of provides the tools and information and data points that we need to share what we already know about our community, but it's so important and critical to have this and be able to use it in so many ways for messaging, for awareness building, for education, and for dispelling myths about our community. I also want to thank our partners at NAPOF, In Our Own Voice, and the National Women's Law Center for making this all happen. As was mentioned earlier, this was a fast and furious effort, but the data and the outcome is really exciting. I think the poll provides a very clear view of where our communities stand when it comes to the Supreme Court and Kavanaugh's nomination, and this will allow us to best engage with them around this vacancy. As we all know, Judge Kavanaugh has a very dangerous judicial record, and if confirmed, will have a devastating impact on immigrants, communities of color, on women's health issues, on LGBT issues, and so on and so forth. And as was mentioned earlier, that Jane mentioned, for our communities, the struggle for reproductive and social justice goes much further than protecting Roe. As we see, it's very clear that what is most critical for us is not persuasion per se, but education. And I really want to underscore that we need to do our best work to inform our community about the Supreme Court, about the vacancy, and about the impact on their lives, and then also what they can do about it, because clearly there is opportunities to continue to motivate our communities. As was mentioned, tying Kavanaugh to Trump makes it clear for our communities what kind of justice he would be. I think that's loud and clear through the data, and of course, from what we know through organizing and working deeply in our community, we can make that that distinction clear and that correlation clear. It's also critical that we connect the Supreme Court to cases related to an array of issues that our communities care about. It was interesting to see how high clean water ranked, but it's very clear, and many of us know, that access to clean water is a huge challenge for our community, and it was at the top of the list. But things like affordable care as well, racial justice, women's equality, workers' rights, immigration, and so forth. These are all issues that intersect with someone's ability to create informed families and be able to parent the families that they choose to create. So these are all reproductive justice issues. And, you know, the Supreme Court cases that have recently come up, right, around LGBTQ rights, around women's access, around workers' rights, is it just a testament of what's at stake. We need to know the next Supreme Court justice will uphold all the constitutional rights of communities of color. And it's clear that Kavanaugh will not do that. And most importantly, and more than ever, we must understand our community's views on the threat that Kavanaugh's appointment would represent, so that we can provide the resources that they need to help stop it and better advocate for our community, and that they are lifting up their voices and feel empowered and feel that they have a role and a stake in this appointment, because we know with this information there's power. And that's why I'm really grateful to have this data. So I just want to thank you all so much for being part of this. And we hope the data and information and the tools that we can provide will be helpful in further educating our communities and advocating for a Supreme Court that we need to see, not the one that's being presented before us. So thank you all.
Great, thanks Jessica so much, and we're going to now turn it over to Jessica Pinkney with In Our Own Voice to offer a few reflections, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Jessica?
Thanks, Gretchen. I just want to reiterate Jessica's thanks to both Tressa for getting this poll out into the field in record time, as well as our wonderful partners at NAPOF, Latina Institute, and National Women's Law Center. I'm Jessica Pinkney. I'm the Deputy Director of Government Affairs for In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. And as many of you probably know, we are a national state partnership with 8 Black women's reproductive justice organizations in California, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Georgia, Texas, and Louisiana. And our goal is to lift up the voices of Black women leaders on national, regional, and state policies that impact the lives of Black women and girls. So a poll like this is incredibly important to the work we're doing, and allows us the opportunity to lift up the unique lived experiences of Black women in particular. I think I would reiterate essentially everything that Jessica pointed out about the power of this data for our advocacy around the Kavanaugh nomination. I think something that really stuck out for our organization was the use of access being stronger than Roe v. Wade specifically. And I think it's really important to note the power of that women's access framing, particularly in this fight, because we're reaching out to so many folks who may have not been around during a time when Roe was not in existence. And so I think it's a really important framework to take forward when thinking about access versus upholding Roe, which may not mean as much to a younger audience. So it was really interesting to see a different response there, and should definitely be taken into account not only when discussing Kavanaugh's nomination, but also when thinking about the future of abortion access. The other thing that was really noticeable for us that Jessica briefly highlighted was connecting SCOTUS to the issues that people care about personally. And we found it very powerful that women of color across the board we're all really in agreement around major areas of concern that haven't always been high on the list of priorities for highlighting in this fight. And we see here a real opportunity to be intersectional about our messaging and framework around the Kavanaugh fight, as Jessica was alluding to, in terms of LGBTQ rights, immigration, other racial justice and civil rights issues, the environment. We clearly saw a lot of concern around having access to clean water. So I think this is a real education opportunity as it comes to reproductive justice and thinking about how we can link together the many issues that are impacting individuals' lives. So we look forward to sharing more soon about messaging and guidance, and really hope that this data can be a useful resource across our reproductive health rights and justice movement.
Great, thanks, Jessica. So we're going to go to Q&A, and then we'll have some closing remarks. But we have one question that's been written in, so I'm going to ask Sarah to read it, and Tressa, this is for you to answer.
Okay, so the question from Winnie Yee is, do we know any other factors about the study participants beyond race, such as education, citizenship, or age? And also, is ethnicity disaggregated? And just a reminder to all of our attendees that you can enter a question at any time through the GoToWebinar chat function.
Yes, good question. Yes, we have data on many demographics: gender, age, education, marital status, income, region of the country, and whether they were born in the U.S. or not. We do not have immigration status, which of course, not surprisingly, is very difficult to ask, but we do have born in the U.S. or not. We do have ethnicity breakouts. We have, because the API community is so diverse, it's very difficult to get enough by one ethnicity to look at, but we can disaggregate Chinese respondents and Indians, and but even so, it's a pretty big margin of error, and so that is always a challenge. But we do have the breakdown, so we do have that data, and that's something we're looking at right now. Our heads are in all of those crosstabs right now to see if are there any differences on messaging by specific segments within these groups. So we'll have that shortly as well.
Can I just add something really quickly? Because we just wanted to, for NAPOP's end, we wanted to just acknowledge these particular limitations of the data for our communities, because the polling was done in English only, and it was done online, which we are fully acknowledging that excludes large segments of our community, and that is the limitation of the data. So that's something that people need to keep in mind when they're thinking about whether or not they can generalize this to communities, that certain parts of our communities were not included in this polling. That's it.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Jane. Yeah. Okay, we have another question here. Sarah's going to read it out, and it's going to we're going to put up another slide to help answer it. So go ahead and read it, Sarah, and we'll pull up the slide.
Okay, so I'm going to read the question first and then get the slide up. So the question from Sarah Ratcliffe is, if possible, could you put up the list of villains/opposition and discuss what the thinking is about how or whether to directly address some of these?
We're just going to pull up the slide. Tressa, if you want to start addressing it, we'll pull up the slide in the meantime.
Yeah, I think, I feel like the messaging might be a little bit iterative. You got to educate people, remind people what's going on, remind people / inform them that Kavanaugh is going through this nomination. talk about here are the issues that are going to be affected, that the Supreme Court's going to make decisions on, and use those top issues. And then I think part of the messaging can be, if Kavanaugh is approved or nominated, here's what's likely. And you talk about his record, Kavanaugh's record around presidential power, and his record, what he's argued in terms of, and we have language on this too, from a different poll where we had oversamples, but language around investigation, not thinking presidents should be investigated. And, I don't know that you need to specifically say, point to Trump as a villain, but I think that does enough, or say he is likely to make rulings that side with, President Trump and his administration. I don't know if other partners have any thoughts on how you might use this.
This is Jessica. This is Jessica from the Latina Institute, because we have another Jessica on the line. But one thing I also want to uplift is that some things that we've learned from just on the ground organizing and talking to the Latinx community is that there needs to be clarification about nomination versus confirmation. So folks also need to understand that even though Trump has nominated Kavanaugh, doesn't mean he's now a justice. There's a process, and that's where the opportunity to influence the process lies. So we have to do the education around, the senators and their role in the process, and that he won't become a justice until there is a confirmation vote. So I think that's something we want to uplift as well, that it's not just connecting him to Trump, but understanding that there's a process. That doesn't mean that Trump nomination means this person's now a justice. I think that has to be clear in our advocacy and our education with many communities.
Great, thanks. So we are just about out of time, and I see there are a couple of questions that are still coming in, so we will try and follow up with those people separately in response to their specific questions, because we don't want to go over our time that we promised you we would take. But I wanted to see if Jane or anybody else had any closing remarks before we wrap.
I just wanted to I wanted to say something just really quickly. I think one of the main takeaways, and probably something that can be a source of encouragement and spurring us to action on this polling, is that I took away that we need to do a better job, as Jessica said, of educating communities of color, but also engaging our communities about what they can do. And I think that the polling about telling people specifically what they can do is very helpful for people to think about when they think about how to engage communities on the ground. And I really encourage people to think more than just telling people to call their senators, but really thinking about ways to engage the community that is calling them to action. And we've been finding that with our own organizing around our reproductive justice day of action, and we've had a overwhelming response that people want to be involved on this, and it's a matter of giving them the opportunity to do so. And that's kind of my encouragement to everyone, to really identify opportunities for people on the ground to engage this SCOTUS fight. Thanks.
Great,
yeah,
thank
and
you.
This is Tressa. Oh, I was just going to reiterate really quick what Jane said is number one, overestimate what information you think people want. More is better. Overestimate the different types of actions they might want to take. Because making one phone call or signing a petition can actually be disempowering if there's a variety of things. So just echoing what Jane has heard on the ground, I've heard in focus groups and research as well.
Okay, thank you everybody so much. Thanks to all the partners who helped with this particular research. Thanks to all of you who did the research before this research that we were able to build on in order to do this deep dive into communities of color. And thank you all for your interest in learning how to talk about these issues in the best way with these communities. And we look forward to working with all of you in these short weeks ahead as we try and derail and stop this really harmful nomination. Thanks everybody. Bye.